We resume today our series on the book of Judges. The Gideon narrative takes us into new territory. First of all, the Gideon account is the longest of all the Judges. 100 verses spanning 3 chapters. Othniel's judgeship covers 5 verses, the account of Ehud, 19 verses, Shamgar, 1 verse. The narrative of Deborah and Barak unfolds in just 23 verses, and then we have the Gideon account, 100 verses. You will recall that Dr. Younger mentioned that as an account gets longer, the quality of the judge declines. That does not bode well for Gideon. Secondly, we go from knowing next to nothing about the judges presented to knowing, well, far more than we would like to know. We know virtually nothing about Othniel except that he's a Kenizzite, the ideal judge. We know that Ehud was left-handed and a stealthy assassin. Shamgar was skilled using an ox goad. Deborah was a prophet. Barak was a hesitant participant. But with Gideon, we know everything. His background, his thoughts, his intentions, his fears, his theology, his vulnerabilities. This dramatic shift in characterization from the simple to the complex is precisely what we need at this point in the book. Our series carries the title, Faith for Faithless Times. So you ask, when does the book start showing us how to have that faith? Well, not today. Instead, we're going to explore the flip side. We're going to answer a question that seldom gets asked, but begs to be answered, and that is, how does faithlessness happen? If we can answer that question, then we will be better positioned to maintain our faith in faithless times. The Gideon narrative has a unique contribution to make to the theological development of the book. Our previous presenters have noted that as the nation went from one cycle of discipline to the next, there was a continual deterioration. There was also a shift in the quality of the judge presented themselves. The Gideon account seems to mark a significant turning point. So God's word for us this morning from Judges 6 through 8 is this: faithlessness can happen whenever God's people become inattentive to the revelation of his character. Faithlessness can happen whenever God's people become inattentive to the revelation of his character. I'm going to follow the narrative structure, which I believe is the only way to make sure that we end up where we're supposed to. Verses 1 to 10 of chapter 6 introduce the Gideon cycle and provide our first principle. Here we will observe that the move toward faithlessness occurs when God's people lose sight of who he is and what he does. The Gideon account opens with the now all too familiar refrain, "The people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." How is that even possible? They have experienced God's deliverance from Jabin, the Canaanite king. However it was that the Philistines were oppressing them, God brought them out of that. Their 18-year subjugation to Eglon, king of Moab, was ended by God. And their days of oppression under Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, were brought to a close by God. And yet we are told, just as we were in chapter 4, verse 1, just as we were in chapter 3, verse 12, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. I guess the narrator was attempting to prepare us for this back in chapter 2, verse 11 and following. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, And they went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord, and they served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So verse 1 reports, the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. Except this time is different. What happened to the Israelites in the previous episodes is different than what happened to them in this situation. It's much more fully presented. We've got robust colors and bold brushstrokes the narrator uses to paint a picture of devastation, of utter destitution. Because of Midian, verse 2 explains, the people of Israel had to take up residence in mountain clefts and caves and strongholds. According to verses 3 and 4, whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance for Israel. They confiscated their sheep, their oxen, and their donkeys. They took everything. They left nothing. As a matter of fact, the verb forms there in verses 3 and 4 capture vividly this wave after wave of pillage and destruction. The narrator's description in verse 5 is apt. They would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted. The result is summarized in verse 6a. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. This devastation should have taken no one by surprise because the curses for opting for not following Yahweh after entering into a covenant with him are spelled out in great detail in Deuteronomy 28. Well, utterly destitute, the people of Israel cry out for help to the Lord. But again, the episode does not deliver what we would expect. In chapter 3, verse 9, when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer. In chapter 3, verse 15, when they cried out to the Lord, he gave them a deliverer. Here in chapter 6, verse 7, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, and we must note, this has nothing to do with repentance. God graciously gave them what they really needed. And that was a word from him. The text says in verse 8, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel. And in a manner similar to what we have in the introduction to the Ten Commandments, the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I led you up from Egypt, and I brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you. I am the one who drove them out before you. I gave you their land, and I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But you have not obeyed my voice. This is theology 101 here. The prophet is describing the person and the work of God. So we have within the span of just 10 verses what Israel did, verse 1, evil in the eyes of the Lord, juxtaposed with what Yahweh did, verses 8 and 9, which require 5 first-person verbs even to begin adequately to describe his redemptive and salvific work, juxtaposed again with what Israel did not do, verse 10, and that is, obey my voice. The move toward faithlessness is inevitable when God's people lose sight of who God is and what he does. It's not actually a matter of forgetting. It's a matter of disregarding. Well, verse 11 introduces a new setting and 2 new characters and a new development and our second principle. Here we will observe that the move toward faithlessness occurs when God's involvement is evaluated on the basis of what we see going on around us, rather than on the basis of what God has already done and said. Here we meet the angel of Yahweh and Gideon, son of Joash, the Abiezrite. The angel of Yahweh is sitting under a terebinth. Gideon is hiding in a winepress. The angel of Yahweh is there to enlist Gideon as the one through whom God will deliver his people. But why is Gideon in a winepress? Well, Gideon is threshing wheat, hiding from the Midianites. Remember the oppression. According to verse 12, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." An interesting way to address a person hiding in a winepress. But the narrator uses this scene, this address, to characterize Gideon. From the first moment we encounter Gideon, he is fearful. He is hesitant. He's reluctant. And he is, for all practical purposes, faithless. In his response to the angel of Yahweh, Gideon challenges the veracity of the messenger's words. Verse 13, the angel of Yahweh says, "The Lord is with you." Gideon responds, "I'm not seeing it. If the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us?" Notice his use of the plural pronoun there, us. "And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?'" And then based on what he sees happening around him and not happening around him, he levels an accusation. "But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian," exhibiting, of course, no awareness or no acknowledgement of why they are in this mess. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Am I not the one sending you?" Again, Gideon deflects. "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." The Lord counters, "But I will be with you. You will strike the Midianites as one man." Gideon is arguing with God. This has never happened before in the book of Judges. I don't mean the arguing, I mean the dialogue. Gideon is the only judge in the book of Judges to whom God speaks directly. And Gideon is arguing with him. Still unable to accept what he's hearing, Gideon makes a request. Verse 17, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, do a sign for me." That is, actually, in fact, you who's speaking to me. Gideon prepared an offering. The angel of the Lord accepted the offering and then vanished from his sight. Then and only then did Gideon perceive, the text says, that he was the angel of the Lord. The text then tells us in verse 24 that Gideon built an altar there at Ophrah to the Lord and called it, "The Lord is Peace." Why did that have to be so difficult? Gideon already knows what God has done. His own words indicate that. Gideon already knows that God is a God who delivers and speaks, but he cannot see past what's going on around him. The move toward faithlessness occurs when God's involvement is evaluated on the basis of what we see happening around us, rather than on the basis of what we know God has already said and done. Verses 25 to 32 introduce a new development. Our principle? The move toward faithlessness occurs when we allow our culture and society to define our theology. Verses 25 to 27 make it clear that Gideon's father, Joash, has a Baal altar and an Asherah pole on his property, strongly suggesting that Gideon's father was a community leader in the Baal cult. So while Joash and everybody else in Israel is crying out to the Lord to help them, they're engaging in Canaanite cult practices and Baal worship, because that's what everybody's doing. Gideon is told by God to do the unthinkable, to do the inconceivable, especially if you've grown up in a Baal-worshiping home. Again, God speaks to Gideon directly in verse 25. Take your father's bull and a second bull 7 years old and pull down the altar of Baal that your father owns. And cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here with stones laid in due order. And then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah pole that you shall cut down. Verse 27 affirms that Gideon did as the Lord had told him. But remembering that Gideon is not a paragon of courage, the narrator explains that he took 10 men of his servants with him, but because he was too afraid of his family, because he was too afraid of the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. But he did it. And that did not go over well. According to verse 28, when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who did this? These Israelites are furious that someone has vandalized the altar of Baal and destroyed their Asherah pole. Well, their search and inquiry didn't take long, and it led directly to Gideon, the son of Joash, verse 29. The men of the town confront Joash and insist in verse 30 that he hand over his son so that he may be put to death for his acts of clandestine desecration. Joash's response is as telling as it is a surprise. Verse 31, Joash said to all of those who stood before him, will you contend for Baal? Or will you save him? Whoever contends for him will be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Does Joash understand what he's saying? If he is a god, let him contend for himself. If he is a god, what is his altar doing in your yard? If he is not really a god, what is his altar doing in your yard? Joash and the people of Ophrah were thoroughgoingly, unthinkingly syncretistic. And we are in an epidemic of it today. The influences are everywhere, and they are pervasive, and they are powerful, and they are subtle. Look at Joash. He doesn't even seem to be aware of the implications of what he's saying. If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself. What? The Israelites were allowing anything and everything in their culture and in their society to inform their theology and to influence their view of God, and it was all too evident in the way they were living. The move toward faithlessness is expedited when we allow our culture and our society to define our theology. Gideon received a new name that day. He became known as Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal contend. Gideon was now walking proof that Baal was powerless. Well, having dealt a fatal blow to Baal, it was time to turn attention to the Midianites. Verses 33 to 35 bring us back to the crisis at hand, describing this ongoing and escalating oppression. These verses introduce the central section of these 3 chapters from which we'll derive our 4th principle. Here we see that the move toward faithlessness occurs when we resist taking God at His word. According to verse 34, the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. He sounded the trumpet and mustered the troops from Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. For the second time now, Gideon proposes in verses 36 to 40 that God validate what He has already said regarding His deliverance of the people. These 5 verses again provide essential insight into Gideon. They highlight his lack of confidence in a particularly striking way. Even after it is clear that he has the support of the people, even though he's set to command a considerable fighting force, he hesitates. He balks. For some reason, he needs to be doubly assured, the wet and dry fleece test, that God is with him and will give him the promised victory. When everyone finally gathers beside the Herod spring in 7:1, the Lord said to Gideon, "There are way too many people here for me to give the Midianites into their hand. I can't work like this. Let Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" So the Lord incrementally pares down the troops. Verse 3, "Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home." 22,000 people take off, leaving only 10,000. Verse 4, the Lord said to Gideon, "Still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them there for you." Well, it was the water test that brought the fighting force down to 300. And the Lord said to Gideon in verse 7, "With the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and I will give the Midianites into your hand." When the final scene before the attack, Yahweh instructs Gideon, verse 9, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand." But knowing that Gideon would be too fearful to survey the enemy camp alone, even under cover of darkness, Yahweh authorizes him to take his servant Purah with him for moral support. What they observe is astounding. The Midianites, of whom they are terrified, who are like locusts in abundance, according to verse 12, camels without number, like the sand on the seashore in abundance, the Midianites are in a state of sheer panic, all because of a dream. When Gideon and Purah were able to get close enough to the Midianite camp to hear the chatter, a certain man, verse 13, was telling a dream to his comrade. He said, "You'll never believe this." That's behold. "I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so it fell, and it turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat." His comrade said, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of God. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp." This statement, "God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp," repeats the promise God has been making to Gideon all along. But now God allowed him to hear it from the lips of a Midianite soldier. The irony here is breathtaking. Hearing the promise directly from God did not convince Gideon, but hearing it from a Midianite soldier did. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, the text says he worshiped. No one in the book of Judges receives more divine assurance than Gideon, and nobody displays more hesitancy and doubt. Gideon is significantly the only judge to whom God speaks directly, except that special access does nothing to allay his faithlessness. The move toward faithlessness is already underway, my friends, when we resist taking God at his word. Judges 7:19 to 8:21 give us two battle accounts against the Midianites in which Gideon and the troops prevail. From the account of these two battles and the ensuing events of chapter 8, 22 to 35, we derive our final principle. Here we are shown that the move toward faithlessness occurs when we begin to think more of ourselves than we ought. In each battle, a pair of Midianite rulers is killed. The battle depicted in chapter 7, verses 9 through 8:3 occurs on the west side of the Jordan. The battle that is narrated in chapter 8, 4 to 21 happens on the east side. The two battles could not be more different. The characterization of Gideon could not be more disturbing. The battle on the west side was strategically timed and effectively executed by Yahweh. The 300 men of Gideon are simply standing there around the camp with their trumpets blaring and torches blazing. The Midianite army was terrified, and the text says that the men ran and cried out and fled. What's Yahweh doing right now? Yahweh is giving the Midianites into Gideon's hand. According to verse 22, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. What an incredible sight that must have been. A ring of fire around the camp, the sound of broken pottery, 300 trumpets in surround sound, 300 men shouting about swords, and the Midianite troops self-destructing, using their own swords on each other. The two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeev, made a run for it, but the men of Ephraim caught them and killed them. The text makes one thing clear. This was God's victory. This was Yahweh's battle. Yahweh told Gideon, I will be with you. And he was. Yahweh promised Gideon 3 times, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. And he did. So the question that comes up at this point is, what happened between verse 3 and verse 4 of chapter 8? The second battle, the battle on the east side of the Jordan, is given in verses 4 through 21 of that 8th chapter. Verse 4 says, Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and his 300 men who were with him, exhausted and yet pursuing. But this is a Gideon we have not seen before. If only the Gideon story could have ended here. Coming off the success of the first battle, Gideon is emboldened, but not in a good way. According to 8:5, he declared purpose is to capture Zevach and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, and he pushes forward to this goal with his steely determination, despite the fact that his men are hungry and exhausted. Gideon asks for bread for his troops from the people of Sukkot, but the request is denied. Gideon promises to make them pay for it for their support. I should just let you hear Gideon for himself here. This is what he says to the officials of Sukkot in verse 7. Well, when the Lord has given Zevach and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh and with switches of desert thorns and briars. I'll be back. From there, he went up to Penuel, made the same request, got the same response, request denied. Gideon's response, I'll be back to break down your defensive tower. Gideon clearly expects Yahweh to hand over Zevach and Zalmunna as surely as he did Orev and Ze'ev at the end of chapter 7. After all, he's Gideon. But unlike the previous battle account, Yahweh is completely absent in the narrative of verses 4 to 21. God is nowhere, except for two references that Gideon makes. The narrator provides no indication of God's approval, no indication of Yahweh's participation, of Yahweh's involvement in any way in this second battle. From this point on, it's Gideon. Emboldened by his successes, invigorated by his new inner Gideon, he proceeds to take matters into his own hands. Verses 10 to 12, he locates the two kings of Midian and captures them. Verses 13 to 16, he follows through on his threats to the officials of the villages of Sukkot and Penuel. Verse 14 tells us that he captured a young man from Sukkot, interrogated him, forced him to write down the names of all of the officials, 77 of them in Sukkot. And then he went to those leaders, reminded them of their non-support when he passed through earlier, and then made good on his promise to flail their flesh with switches of desert thorns and briars. And of course, Gideon's rampage would not be complete if he did not go up to Penuel and destroy their defensive tower, as he said he would do, and kill the men of the city as well. Verses 18 and 19 show us his motivation. God is not behind this. Zevach and Zalmunna had been responsible for the death of his brothers. So what Gideon is doing here is personal. Gideon's own agenda, not God's, is driving force of this movement. This is a vendetta. And the fact that he even wanted to use his own son, his firstborn, to kill them, to humiliate them, and to cause them great suffering makes this all the worse. This is what faithlessness looks like. And this is one way that it happens. The move toward faithlessness is inevitable when we begin to think more of ourselves than we ought. And it's easy to do that around here. Well, leaving the two battles, we come to the final scene in the story, and that's Gideon's own situation. Gideon's slaughter of the two Midianite kings has elevated him in the eyes of his people. The king slayer has achieved kingly status in their eyes. They attribute their deliverance directly to Gideon. And they propose a way forward. Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. The very thing that the Lord was concerned about back in chapter 7, verse 12 has happened. Israel is failing to recognize that it was that it was God who delivered them. Crediting Gideon with their deliverance, wanting to elevate him to divine status, God's people could not have been more inattentive to the revelation of God's character. The question that looms large over the Gideon account is, will anybody remember who God is? Will anyone recognize that it is God who has saved them? Well, Gideon objects. Verse 23, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you either. The Lord will rule over you. Well, that's the theologically correct answer. But Gideon's reference to God does not seem to have any effect causing Israel to see things any more clearly. The damage has already been done. The focus is no longer on God, and of course Gideon bears some responsibility for that by diverting belief away from God and moving it to belief in himself. One evidence of this is that Gideon does not deny, he does not downplay his own involvement in the victory. He doesn't pinpoint. He doesn't highlight the fact that it was actually God who had delivered Israel. So Gideon fails in his role as a theological interpreter. Israel's response is partly of Gideon's own making because he's presenting here a mixed message. Any reader can see this. He says, I will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you. But he keeps acting more and more like a king. No longer is Gideon the hesitant, halting, fearful character that we met in a wine press in chapter 6. Gideon has just personally killed 2 kings, and in some ways resembles a king himself. According to verses 30 to 31, Gideon had many wives and 70 sons, and he had a concubine over at Shechem who bore him a son, and he named that boy Abimelech. Avimelech. Translation, my father is king. He says, I will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you, but he asks for earrings from the spoil of the war that he waged, and then he melts that down to fashion an ephod, an action that signifies Gideon's self-glorification. He says, I will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you, but the people are all too eager in verse 25 to give up their spoils of war, which not only adds to Gideon's self-aggrandizement, but it also creates an idol which everyone which leads Israel even further away from God. At the end of the story, Ophrah has become an ephod worship center, the focus of national idolatry. When the story began, Ophrah was simply a center for the Baal cult and a center for family worship. So here in Ophrah, the final irony of the story emerges. Gideon, champion of Yahweh against Baal, is now presiding over national apostasy. These chapters have shown us how faithlessness can happen. It's important for us to know, especially as those giving leadership to the church, how faithlessness can happen so that we can prevent it from happening. There's no mystery here. There's no formula here. Faithlessness can happen whenever God's people become inattentive to the revelation of God's character. Faithlessness can happen when God's people lose sight of who He is and what He does. When we evaluate God's involvement in our world on the basis of what we see going on around us, rather than on the basis of what we know God has already done and has said. Faithlessness can happen when we allow our culture and society to define our theology and distort our faith. Faithlessness can happen when we resist taking God at His word and when we begin to think more of ourselves than we ought. There is not one of these that does not confront us every day. And it takes only one of these to put us on the path of faithlessness. Too many today are finding that path. May God strengthen us and strengthen our resolve to be men and women of faith. To be always attentive to the revelation of God's character. To desire always to worship Him and Him alone. And to take Him at His word. That's what God wants. Amen.